I had always believed that our marriage was built on trust, faith, and mutual respect. My wife Emily was a devout woman. Every Sunday, she would dress in her finest, and I would drop her at the church before heading to my own commitments. I never imagined that the very place where she proclaimed virtue and morality could become the stage for the most profound betrayal I would ever endure. It began subtly, as most affairs do. Emily started spending more time at church functions, Bible study groups, charity events, choir rehearsals. First, I welcomed it. I thought she was simply nurturing her faith, strengthening her connection with the community. But a nagging discomfort began to grow inside me, a quiet alarm I could not ignore. There were late-night messages, sudden appointments that she claimed were urgent, and an intensity in her tone when speaking about the pastor, Reverend Jacobs, that seemed almost personal. One evening I returned home earlier than expected. Emily had told me she was attending a church committee meeting. The house was silent, too silent. I checked her phone, something I had never done before. And there it was, the messages that would shatter my world. They weren't casual conversations about scripture or church events. They were intimate, flirtatious, and unmistakably inappropriate. I sat on the couch, my hands trembling, staring at the screen, trying to comprehend how someone I trusted so completely could betray me in such a sacred context. I confronted her the next morning, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Emily, we need to talk. Now." She looked up from her breakfast, her expression carefully neutral, as though she had been rehearsing for this moment. I laid the phone on the table, showing her the messages. There was a pause, a moment of silence where I could see the faintest flicker of guilt in her eyes. But she quickly masked it with defensiveness, claiming the pastor had only been giving her spiritual guidance, and that I was misinterpreting everything. I wanted to scream, to throw accusations, to break down, but I knew I had to stay calm. Every detail I had learned, every late night, every lie I catalogued in my mind. I would not confront her out of anger. I would confront her with strategy. I needed to ensure that the betrayal did not remain hidden, that it was exposed in a way that would leave no doubt, not just for me, but for the very community she had used as her shield. I realized then that this was no longer just about personal hurt. It was about justice, truth, and exposing hypocrisy in the very place she had pretended to be virtuous. And in my mind the path became clear. If the church preached about morality and sin, then Emily's sin would become a lesson for all. I began observing carefully, noting every pattern, every opportunity where Emily and Reverend Jacobs interacted. I didn't act rashly. Patience was my ally. I attended church occasionally, blending into the pews, watching from a distance. Their interactions were subtle to an outsider but glaringly obvious to me. Long glances, whispered conversations, the occasional brush of hands. I felt the familiar churn of betrayal, but this time it was accompanied by a cold clarity. I would not let this go unnoticed. I started keeping records, dates, times, descriptions of events, snippets of overheard conversations. My mind ran like a machine, analyzing every message and gesture. I remembered every promise Emily had made on our wedding day, every vow of faith and fidelity, and contrasted it against the reality she had created. It was infuriating, humiliating, and yet empowering, because I realized that I held the key to uncovering the truth, to orchestrating the exposure that would leave no room for denial. Then came the moment that set everything into motion. The annual church sermon series was approaching, a time when Reverend Jacobs would speak on sin, morality, and the dangers of straying from faith. I knew this was my chance. I didn't need to confront Emily directly. I didn't need an argument or a dramatic scene. I needed subtlety, patience, and precision. I started speaking with a few members of the congregation I trusted, framing my concerns carefully, making it clear that what I was revealing wasn't rumor. It was documented, verifiable, undeniable. As the week of the sermon arrived, Emily was oblivious to the storm about to descend. She dressed as usual, smiled at me with practiced affection, and left for church, confident in her own cunning. Meanwhile, I prepared, ensuring that the relevant details reached the right people. The elders, a few respected members, anyone who had a voice in shaping what the pastor would address. My goal wasn't vengeance in the petty sense. It was exposure, and ensuring that the moral lesson would not just be abstract, but deeply personal for the one who had violated trust in such a sacred place. Sunday arrived. The church was full, the air thick with the anticipation of Reverend Jacob's sermon. I sat quietly in the back, observing, heart pounding, every instinct alert. Emily walked in, radiant as always, oblivious to the careful orchestration that had been taking place behind the scenes. She smiled at familiar faces, exchanged pleasantries, and settled into her seat. But the moment the pastor began speaking, referencing the sins of betrayal, misuse of trust, and hypocrisy cloaked in piety, I could see the subtle shift in her demeanor. Her smile faltered, her eyes darted nervously, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of truth poised to make its mark. Emily's face turned pale as Reverend Jacobs continued, speaking with authority and solemnity. Those who hide sins behind a facade of virtue may think themselves clever, but truth has a way of surfacing, he said, his gaze sweeping the congregation. I watched her shift in her seat, glancing nervously at friends and fellow parishioners. There was no direct accusation, no naming names, but the context was unmistakable. Everyone who knew her, everyone who had seen the subtle signs, understood immediately. The tension in the church was palpable. I kept my composure, sitting silently, letting the truth unravel naturally. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her Bible, her usual confident posture now replaced with unease. I felt a strange combination of relief and triumph, not from seeing her humiliated, but from finally witnessing the truth brought to light in the setting she had so often used to conceal it. After the sermon, whispers filled the hall. Members exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Emily tried to keep her head high, offering polite nods, but the damage had been done. The veil of her deception had been lifted. I had achieved what I had set out to do, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through patience, observation, and subtle orchestration. The truth was now undeniable, a lesson that would linger far beyond the walls of the church. That evening at home, Emily avoided my gaze. She had no words, no excuses that could undo what had been exposed. I didn't need to chastise her, didn't need to demand explanations. The events of the day, the reactions of those around her, had spoken louder than any argument I could have made. Silence filled the room, a quiet acknowledgement of the rift that could never be repaired. I reflected on what had transpired, on the intricate dance of deceit and revelation. Betrayal is often subtle, masked in normalcy, hidden in routine gestures and false smiles. But it leaves traces, evidence that only careful observation can detect. My resolve was tested, my patience stretched, but in the end, I had not only preserved my dignity but ensured that truth prevailed. The lesson was clear. Deceit has no sanctuary, and those who hide it in the most sacred places will eventually be exposed. Emily's affair had been her biggest sin, one that she believed would remain secret. She underestimated the quiet strength of patience, the meticulous attention to detail, and the unwavering commitment to truth. I had turned her betrayal into a lesson not just for her, but for everyone around her, proving that hypocrisy cannot hide indefinitely, even in the halls of the righteous. As I watched her sit in silence, I realized that justice was not about vengeance. It was about clarity, consequence, and the affirmation of values I could never compromise.